Welcome to Break the Loop, the place where shadows transform into personal power. Here we break the loop, shift timelines, and step into the highest version of ourselves. And today, we're going to explore one of the most misunderstood ideas in the personal growth world: timeline shifting. Not as a mystical fantasy, not as an abstract spiritual idea, but as a grounded, psychological, and scientifically informed process. A real transformation that happens inside your identity, your emotional state, your decisions, your behavior, and your perception of reality. By the end of this episode, you will understand exactly what a lower timeline is, what a higher timeline is, how you shift from one to the other, and how to stabilize the new timeline so it becomes your lived reality instead of a momentary experience that fades away. A timeline is not a magical alternate universe. A timeline is a trajectory, a path shaped by identity, emotion, belief, nervous system patterns, micro-decisions, and the feedback loops that repeat throughout your life. Your timeline is the sum of who you believe you are, what you expect from yourself, how you respond emotionally, and what you choose in the small moments that seem insignificant but actually determine everything. This means every person is living inside a psychological timeline, a pattern with a beginning, a middle, and an expected continuation. Most people assume their future is created by fate or luck or circumstance, but in truth, your future is created by the identity you embody today. Your identity is the engine that pulls your timeline forward. When your identity changes, your timeline changes. When your identity stays the same, your timeline repeats. Let's begin with the lower timeline, the one you fall into when you operate from unconscious loops, shadow patterns, emotional autopilot, and survival instincts created in the past. The lower timeline is not bad. It's simply familiar, predictable, safe to your nervous system even if it's not healthy for your life. The lower timeline is the path of more of the same. Same thoughts, same reactions, same emotional spikes, same patterns in relationships, same fears about the future, same habits that keep you stuck. It's the version of your life where you repeat variations of the same story, different characters, different settings, but the emotional script stays the same. You know you're in the lower timeline when life feels tight, small, repetitive, heavy, or predictable. You feel like you're looping emotionally. You feel like life keeps showing you the same lesson. You feel like you keep meeting the same versions of people. You feel like you're reacting instead of choosing. You feel like your potential is bigger than the life you're living. You feel the gap between who you are and who you could be. That gap is your timeline tension, the pull between the lower and higher timelines. Now let's talk about the higher timeline, the version of your life that emerges when your identity expands, your emotional regulation strengthens, your nervous system stabilizes, your awareness deepens, and your choices come from consciousness instead of autopilot. The higher timeline is not about manifesting a perfect life. It is about aligning with the version of you who acts, thinks, feels, and chooses from a higher level of self-leadership. On the higher timeline, you respond instead of react. You choose emotional honesty instead of emotional avoidance. You choose courage instead of the familiar comfort of fear. You choose boundaries instead of self-abandonment. You choose growth instead of repetition. You choose clarity instead of confusion. The higher timeline feels like expansion, possibility, momentum, authenticity, peace, synchronicity. It feels like life is opening instead of closing. You don't become a different person in one moment, but you begin to embody a different identity, and that identity aligns you with a different future. So here is the key: identity equals timeline. You don't enter a higher timeline. You become the version of you who already lives there. People misunderstand this because they think timelines are external. They think, a higher timeline is a better life that I somehow jump into. No, a higher timeline is a higher version of you, and when you stabilize in that version, the external world rearranges accordingly. Think of it like this: your identity is a filter that determines what you notice, what you ignore, what you tolerate, what you pursue, what you attract, and what you sabotage. Change the filter. You change the experience. You change the story. You change the timeline. You cannot hold the same identity and live a different timeline. That's why willpower fails. That's why repeating affirmations doesn't work. That's why habits fall apart. Because you're trying to change the timeline while keeping the identity that creates the old one. Now let's talk about the timeline tension zone, the uncomfortable space between the lower and higher timelines. This is the region where most people give up. When you begin shifting timelines, your nervous system will protest, your old identity will panic, your emotional loops will activate, your shadow will try to pull you backward, and your familiar reactions will tempt you to repeat the same pattern because the old timeline is predictable. This tension is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It is a sign that you're doing something powerful. Timeline tension is proof that you're leaving the gravitational pull of your old identity. It feels like doubt, friction, self-criticism, confusion, fear, or resistance. But this resistance is the final layer of the loop trying to keep itself alive. If you push through this zone, the new identity begins to stabilize. If you collapse into the old reaction, the old timeline reactivates. This is why most people bounce between breakthrough and relapse. Not because they're weak, but because they never learned how to navigate the tension zone. This brings us to the quantum choice point, one of the most important concepts in this episode. A timeline shift doesn't happen in a big dramatic moment. It happens in a small, quiet one. A choice point is a moment where your old identity wants to react one way, and your new identity whispers, "Choose differently." Your old identity wants to shut down emotionally, but your new identity wants to stay open. Your old identity wants to blame or project, but your new identity wants to take ownership. Your old identity wants to repeat the familiar reaction, but your new identity wants to pause, breathe, and respond from awareness. Every time you choose the new identity, you collapse the probability of the old timeline and strengthen the probability of the new one. This is quantum theory made practical. In quantum mechanics, multiple states exist as probabilities until one is chosen through interaction. In psychology, multiple futures exist until identity chooses one through action. The quantum choice point is where your future is shaped. But identity and probability are not enough. Emotion is the tuning fork for the timeline you land on. When you are in a state of fear, shame, overwhelm, self-doubt, emotional shutdown, or survival, you naturally align with the lower timeline because those emotional states produce familiar survival responses. When you are in a state of groundedness, clarity, self-leadership, courage, emotional honesty, and nervous system regulation, you naturally align with the higher timeline. This doesn't mean you have to be happy or positive. It means you have to be conscious. Awareness is the emotional frequency that lifts you out of autopilot. When you feel your emotions instead of suppressing them, you rise. When you name your emotions instead of letting them control you, you rise. When you allow your emotions to move through your body instead of looping in your mind, you rise. Emotional awareness is how you tune into a higher timeline. Now let's address the shadow anchors, the emotional, psychological, and behavioral patterns that pull you back into the lower timeline. Shadow anchors are the parts of you that are unhealed, unseen, suppressed, or avoided. They are the unresolved stories you still believe about yourself. They are the emotional imprints from childhood that your nervous system repeats because they feel familiar. They are the emotional echoes that recreate old reactions. They are the survival identities that formed when you were younger. The part of you that shuts down to stay safe. The part of you that people pleases to avoid abandonment. The part of you that becomes angry to avoid vulnerability. These shadow anchors are not bad. They are simply outdated. They were created by a younger version of you who was doing their best. The moment you bring awareness to them, they begin to lose power. Awareness loosens the anchor. Identity lifts the anchor. Behavioral change breaks the anchor entirely. And this is where the identity lift happens. Shifting to a higher timeline requires embodying the identity that lives there. Not pretending, not faking, embodiment. What does that mean? It means you think as that identity would think. You breathe as that identity would breathe. You speak to yourself as that identity would speak. You tolerate what that identity would tolerate. You choose what that identity would choose. Identity is not a performance. It is a neurological, emotional, and behavioral recalibration. When your nervous system begins to feel safe in this new identity, it becomes your baseline, and the higher timeline becomes your new normal. But identity stabilization is not dramatic. It is built through micro-shifts, the tiny decisions you make each day that reinforce the new identity, waking up and choosing honesty instead of avoidance, taking a breath before reacting, seeing your emotional spike and naming it instead of collapsing into it, making one decision that the old you would never make, setting one boundary, showing one moment of courage, saying one thing you were afraid to say. Each micro-shift strengthens the neurological pathway of the new identity, and those pathways become the behavioral foundation of the new timeline. People expect transformation to be huge, but it is actually built through 5-second moments repeated consistently. How do you know you're entering the higher timeline? You begin to feel more neutral instead of reactive. You feel a deeper sense of inner authority. You feel moments of calm in situations that used to trigger you. You notice synchronicities, small coincidences that feel meaningful. You make decisions that feel aligned even if they're unfamiliar. You start attracting new people, new opportunities, new conversations. You begin experiencing life as if it's supporting your growth instead of highlighting your wounds. The external world starts to reflect your internal identity. This is not magic. It is psychological resonance. Life becomes clearer because you are clearer. Now let's talk about the timeline collapse ritual, a simple internal process to release the lower timeline and solidify the higher one. The ritual has 3 steps: awareness, identity, and action. First, awareness. This is the old timeline. This is the old reaction. I see it. I choose differently. Second, identity. Who do I choose to be right now? What would the higher version of me do in this moment? And third, action. Do the new behavior immediately. The ritual takes less than a minute, but it is one of the fastest ways to collapse the old timeline and activate the new one. Let's integrate this with 2 real-life examples. Imagine someone who always shuts down in conflict. Their lower timeline is emotional withdrawal, resentment, disconnection. But one day, they pause, breathe, identify the old pattern, and say, I choose to stay present. That single moment shifts their timeline because their identity is no longer controlled by fear. Another example, someone who always chooses people who are unavailable. Their lower timeline is heartbreak, longing, emotional inconsistency. But one day they recognize the shadow anchor, the belief that they don't deserve stability, and choose differently. They walk away. They hold a boundary. They say no. That single act collapses the lower timeline and activates the new one, the timeline of self-worth, clarity, and emotional groundedness. And now we close this chapter on timeline shifting. You've learned what a timeline truly is, how the lower timeline is shaped by shadow and emotional autopilot, how the higher timeline is shaped by identity and conscious choice, and how every moment presents a quantum choice point where you collapse the old future and activate the new one. This marks a turning point in your transformation, because once you understand timelines, you stop feeling like life is happening to you, and you start realizing you are the one directing the path ahead. Next week, in episode 10, we begin a new phase of the Shadow to Power series. We dive into emotional intelligence, emotional signals, and the nervous system, the exact tools you need to maintain your higher timeline without slipping back into old loops. You'll learn how to read your emotional field like a map, how to recognize the moment your body begins drifting into the lower timeline, and how to shift yourself back instantly. This next episode is the foundation of long-term stability. Until then, break the loop, shift the timeline, and become your higher self.